Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's begin today's session of comprehensive news analysis with the first article that we have for you today, focusing on the problem of road safety that we have in India. Now, the bottom line is, while India has only 1% vehicles in the entire world, India accounts for close to 11% of the road accidents that take place anywhere in the world. Means India's share in road accidents is disproportionately extremely high. This article focuses on the reasons behind that and what exactly can be done to solve this issue in order to save the lives of lakhs and lakhs of people in India. The author here says that the government of India has itself set a target of reducing 50% of road accidents by 2025. Not just this, the government of India, through the central cabinet minister, that is Shri Nitin Gadkari, said that the government aims to achieve zero deaths due to road accidents by 2030. Now, the government of India has made a lot of attempts in this regard, but somehow those attempts have not been translated on the ground. One of the reasons behind that is that the responsibility of enforcing these road safety laws is with the states in India, and different states have different views on that. For instance, the government of India amended the Motor Vehicle Act and increased the fines for traffic violations many folds. For example, earlier, while the fine for jumping a red light was only 100 or 200 rupees, now it has been increased to 2000 rupees. However, many state governments, fearing that the people of their state would not like it, did not implement this law. This law has only been implemented in a few states, and the others are continuing on the old law itself. The article says that the problem of road safety is not just unique to India. In 2010, the UN General Assembly adopted the Global Plan for the Decade of Action for Road Safety from 2011 to 2020. The aim was that in this decade, throughout the world, the road accidents shall reduce by at least 50% by the time that we reach the year 2020. However, that aim has not been achieved, at least not in India. In India, in 2011, the number of deaths due to road accidents were about 1,42,000. By the end of 2019, the number jumped to over 1,51,000. There was a slight dip in 2020, but that is mainly because of the lockdown situation that we had in the country, because of which the number of vehicles out on the roads were considerably lesser as compared to the earlier years. The author says that India's numbers fare extremely badly when it comes to road safety. For example, if you take the parameter of fatality, considering the fatality would be a number of deaths per 100 accidents. In 2001, the number of deaths per 100 accidents in India was 26.9, which has jumped to over 37.5 in 2020. Means more than one third of the people involved in road accidents actually end up losing their life, which is a dismal number. The Supreme Court also has tried to intervene in this situation and asked the government to make a committee on road safety. That committee was eventually formed under the leadership of Justice K.S. Radhakrishnan and gave a lot of valuable suggestions, most of which have still not been implemented by the government in the states. Not just this, the Supreme Court also gave orders such as making of State Road Safety Council, establishing a lead agency, setting up of Road Safety Fund, setting up of District Road Safety Committee, etc. The court had also asked the government to focus on the black spots, that is, those parts of the roads in India which are highly susceptible to accidents. Maybe because of the way that the turn is taking place, maybe because of the absence of any traffic lights, or maybe because of the condition of the road. There are a lot of black spots across the country where a large number of accidents usually take place. But despite all these suggestions and directives given by the court, in reality, most of them have not seen the light of the day. As I said earlier in the beginning of the discussion, the government of India had amended the Motor Vehicle Act of 1988 to increase the tax for traffic violations many folds. This was done mainly to deter the people from breaking a traffic rule. For example, when you're driving a car, you might jump a red light thinking that even if you're caught, you only would have to pay a fine of 100 or 200 rupees. But at the same time, when you know that you would have to pay a fine of 2000 rupees for jumping that red light, you would think twice before doing that. But many states did not implement it, fearing of backlash from the people. In fact, let me give you a personal example. In Delhi, for instance, after the traffic violation fines were increased, whenever people were driving on the roads, and even when there were traffic lights which were not working, When people knew that this traffic light will not turn into green because this is not working, even then, out of the fear of being challaned or having to pay such a fine, people just did not want to cross that red light. They waited for many minutes before a traffic inspector would come in and ask them to go. That was the impact that it had in Delhi and still continues to have in many parts of the country where the new law was actually implemented. The other problem, as per the author, is that the number of people that are required to enforce the new laws or the old traffic laws are insufficient. With increasing population and increasing earning capacity of the people in India, the number of cars and two-wheelers on the roads is on a constant increase. But there is no corresponding increase in the number of traffic officials. In metro cities such as Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, there is a lot of automation that has been put in place. For example, there are cameras on the road that can detect the speed of the vehicle, and a challan can be issued if you are going above the speed limit without the need to have any traffic inspector there. But that is only in a few cities in India. In most of tier 2, tier 3 cities, we don't have any such automation present. And you would know it yourself when you're traveling in a big city such as Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, etc. You yourself would put on your helmet, you would make sure that you have your seatbelt on. But when you go to a tier 2, tier 3 cities or in the highways, when you know that there is no authority to check on you, there are many people who would remove their helmet, who would let off their seat belts, etc., just because you know that you would not get caught. Thus, in order to deter the people from breaking the traffic rules, we need to have enforcement agencies present. Even in the big cities, the speed limit signs are very rarely seen. It is only on the main road that you see signs telling you what is the maximum speed allowed here. The other reason, as per the author, is that most of the drivers are not full time or formal workers in the transport companies, meaning that they don't get a lot of benefits such as paid leaves, etc. And that is why these drivers are forced to work overtime. There are many instances when you board cabs such as Ola and Uber, and that particular driver would have been driving for over 12 to 15 hours continuously. And obviously, when a person is at the seat for so long, there is bound to be a reduction in the efficiency, and the chances of having an accident because the person is losing the concentration are much higher. In India, especially in tier 2, tier 3 cities, getting a driving license also is not a tough task. Many of you or the people you know would never have even given a driving test before the driving license. There is no standard written or practical test that you see in most of the cities before the driving licenses are issued. And thus, many people who are driving cars or bikes on the roads in India right now are not really suitable enough to drive those vehicles. When you look at the numbers of accidents and the deaths that have taken place, it is evident that the people who are driving two-wheelers or who are pillion riders in the two-wheelers are much more susceptible to these accidents. Two-thirds of the victims of road fatalities are actually the ones who are driving two-wheelers. But even then, whenever the policies are made, not much emphasis is given to those two-wheelers. For instance, there should be a different pathway for the two-wheelers separately so that the four-wheelers or heavy vehicles could not enter there. But that also is not really the case. And that goes the other way around also. In many big cities such as Delhi, Bangalore, etc., you would see a separate pathway just for the bus. But whenever the pathway is empty or whenever there is any space, there are many two-wheelers and even the cars that enter that pathway, which gives rise to dangerous traffic situations. The other focus point is that even after someone gets involved in the accident, the doctors define something as the golden hour. Golden hour means that if someone gets medical attention within 1 hour of their accident, their chances of surviving are much, much higher as compared to when they get the medical care later. That is why you have to encourage people on the roads that if they see an accident, they need to call the public authorities and they need to get that concerned person to the hospital nearby. For that purpose, the government of India did initiate a helpline number that is 112, which has been working well in few states but not across the country in a uniform manner. That also is something that the government must pay attention towards. Now, this road safety issue is not really a new problem in India. It is one of those things that we keep on ignoring because new problems start coming on our minds and start occupying our minds. But this is a problem that we have always had in India and have never been able to solve completely. Recently, the World Bank gave a report specially focusing on the issue of road safety in India. It is a World Bank report that said that despite having just 1% of the world's vehicles, India accounts for 11% of all the road crash deaths. In fact, India is witnessing 53 road crashes every hour, killing one person every 4 minutes, which is a great harm to India's demographic dividend. Now, such road accidents and such fatalities have multiple implications. For example, the people who are involved in road accidents, majority of them belong to poor families, especially because they can't afford vehicles having greater safety measures. They mostly are on two-wheelers and they are not in cars, which are much more safer. That is why their loss of life would have much more impact on the poor families. It is seen that such an accident in a poor family results in a decline of 75% of the total household income in the low income groups. Impact on women is much more. Usually in the poor families where male is the only working person, when he passes away or is disabled because of the accident, the women would have to take up the work. That impacts their entire balance of the family. In most of these accident cases, there are a few reasons that keep on repeating themselves. For instance, human error, that may be because of lack of driving skills, that may be because you are drunk, that may be because you are using a mobile phone or you are not an apt driver, that may be because of the road environment. In a lot of places in your own city, you would have seen that the roads are made in such a way where the chance of having accidents are much more. Maybe two roads would be converging at one single time. Maybe if you're coming from the service road here and you're merging on the new road, there is no red light here to stop the vehicles coming from behind you. All these are a part of road engineering, and not a lot of emphasis is given on that in India. Vehicular condition can also be one of them. In India, most people are not really used to spending a lot on the maintenance of their vehicle. That makes their vehicle much more susceptible. Also, as I said, even after someone gets involved in an accident, there is a considerable delay in getting that person to the medical facility. All of that means that the number of fatalities in India in case of road accidents are considerably higher. The government, on the other hand, has been trying to make some efforts. For example, India is a signatory to the Brasilia Declaration and is committed to reduction in fatalities in road accidents. The government has also ensured that the cars being made in India are much safer. For instance, earlier, the base model of most of the cars did not even have one airbag. But now it is compulsory to have at least one airbag in every car, irrespective of whichever model it is. The government is also trying to make new laws. For example, we just discussed that the government has increased the fine on traffic violations, and the government is also trying to ensure that the roads that have black spots are made again and proper engineering measures are taken in place. The other suggestions for the government are to pay attention to the recommendations given by the K.S. Radhakrishnan panel that was formed by the Supreme Court. They suggested creating more awareness amongst the people about driving on the roads, providing enough compensation to the victims, and maybe adopting the Tamil Nadu model for identifying and removing black spots. Tamil Nadu used to be one of the states that used to have very high rate of accidents in India. But in the past few years, they have re-engineered many of their roads, especially the ones which were highly susceptible to accidents, which has given great results to them. Also, government should pay more attention to those sections of the drivers which are more susceptible. People on the two-wheelers, people who are just walking on the roads, for them, there has to be a specific pathway created. Also, states such as Delhi and Karnataka have the Good Samaritan law that can be enforced in other parts. Let me give you an example of Delhi. For example, in Delhi, the law is that if you see an accident on the road, you can take the victim to the nearest hospital and you would not have to pay any single rupee. No question would be asked from you, and even you would also get rewarded from the government side for this good behavior. Because mostly when the people see an accident on the road, they don't want to get involved or take the person to the hospital thinking that they would have to answer questions to hospital, to police, or they might have to deposit some money in the hospital. So that fear is being taken out in states such as Delhi. That law can be introduced in other states as well. The next article that we have here talks about India UAE relations in the context of the two countries going ahead and signing the comprehensive free trade agreement, which will give a boost to the bilateral trade relations specifically. Now, UAE has historically been one of the largest trading partners of India, continuously featuring in the top three. But the reality is that the major component of that trade is the oil import that India has to UAE. And the government has been trying to diversify that and engage with UAE on trade issues on a lot of other sectors as well, including services, automobiles, medicines, etc. And this is not just the Indian government that is trying to diversify it. The UAE also, on its end, is trying to diversify their economy and wants to earn money in other ways as well, rather than just being dependent on oil export. The government of India has prioritized at least six nations or regions with which they want to sign free trade agreement by the end of this year. They include the UK, European Union, Australia, Canada, Israel, and a group of nations in the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes the UAE as well. With UAE, the government is signing the early harvest deal, which will enlarge into a comprehensive free trade agreement in the due course of time. The early harvest deal is usually a precursor to a free trade agreement. This is kind of an interim agreement which is used to liberalize tariffs on the trade of certain goods between the two countries. Once this is successful, it usually expands and becomes a full fledged free trade agreement between the two sides. The UAE also announced in September 2021 that it would pursue bilateral economic agreements with multiple nations, including India, UK, Turkey, South Korea, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Israel, and Kenya. Now, this is not a new trend. In fact, a lot of countries in the Middle East, the ones who have been dependent on exporting oil and gas to earn most of their revenue, have been trying to diversify their economic portfolio because they also know somewhere down the line, the entire world would not be dependent on oil and they would run out of that oil sometime down the line. That is why nations such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, all of these have been trying to diversify their economic standing and invest in trade relations in other sectors as well. Qatar, for example, has been the leader in this. They have been investing in real estates throughout the world. Some of the most expensive and prestigious football clubs are owned by Qatar, and Qatar's sovereign fund invests in many countries throughout the world. The same effort is being put by the UAE as well. The UAE has announced their Vision 2021, under which they want to diversify their economy and reduce the dependency on oil. Although hydrocarbon sector has always been the big push for the UAE in terms of its economy, but they are now focusing on services and manufacturing as well. And they see India as an important partner in that. Now, the India UAE ties go back to 1972. However, till 2010, the ties were mostly about India importing oil from UAE and a lot of Indians going to UAE to work for blue collar jobs. However, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited UAE in August 2015. That was a beginning of boosting relations between the two sides. It was followed by the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi coming to India in Jan 2017 as a chief guest at India's Republic Day celebrations. It was then that the two sides decided to lay a foundation for eventually having a free trade agreement which is now being signed between the two sides. The bilateral trade merchandise between the two sides for 2021-22 was about $52 billion, which made UAE India's third largest trading partner. The aim is for this trade to reach $100 billion in terms of trade merchandise. On the other hand, we are aiming for the services trade to reach a mark of $15 billion in the coming 5 years. Not just trade, UAE has also made considerable investment in India's market. The current investment by the UAE stands just below $12 billion, making UAE the ninth largest investor in India. India also has been setting up multiple manufacturing units either as joint ventures or in the special economic zones for cement, building materials, textile, etc. As you know, UAE is constantly making new buildings and new parks, etc., which requires a lot of building material. So, manufacturing companies specifically have always had a lot of demand in the UAE, and that is what India has been trying to exploit. The Indian government's overall aim for its merchandise export is $1 trillion by 2030. A similar aim has been made by the Indian government for its services sector. And to achieve this aim, UAE can play an important role in helping India explore its market, not just in the UAE, but in other countries of the Gulf region as well. That is because UAE shares a common market and a customs union with many of those nations, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Egypt, Iraq, Morocco, Palestine, Syria, etc. Now, India is hoping that once we get a free access or a much improved access to the UAE, this in turn will give us access to most of these markets as well. The same way in which India was interested in making better relations with the UK, through which we wanted to explore most of the EU market earlier. The same strategy is what India is applying to UAE and the Middle East nations and exploring trade ties with them. Also understand that when we say free trade agreement, that does not really mean that there will be zero taxes put on all the products that you are sending to the other country. There is a set standard minimum tariff which is used for most of the products. The UAE uses a tariff structure of about 5% flat rate on all the nations with which it has signed an agreement. India would also be considered under this tariff agreement. However, the one thing that India has to be wary about is that when we export stuff to nations such as UAE, they also have a lot of requirements that the products have to fulfill. There are minimum requirements for quality, the quality standards have to be maintained. Otherwise, we would not be able to take advantage of those agreements. For example, UAE has set a lot of standard agreements for live poultry, meat, processed food, etc. And if those standards are not fulfilled, then the UAE government might put a lot of non-tariff barriers also, which will make it extremely difficult for the Indian companies to sell their products to UAE. So those compliances also pose a challenge for the Indian exporters because we need to raise our quality and ensure that the quality is maintained whenever we are trying to export any stuff to the UAE. Now, while the agreement that we are signing with the UAE is called the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, there are actually multiple other trade agreements that you might have heard of. And each of them have their own unique characteristics. For example, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement is kind of a free trade pact only, which covers negotiations in terms of trade, services, investment, etc. But it even goes one step ahead and it may even involve negotiations on customs cooperation, intellectual property rights, etc. It also looks into the regulatory aspects of the trade and makes an agreement which covers even the most regulatory issues. India has already signed such agreements with South Korea and Japan. Then we have the free trade agreement that we keep on hearing about around the world. It is an agreement in which two or more nations agree to have preferential trade terms. As I said, it's not like all the products will be taxed at 0%, but there is an understanding that most of the products would be taxed lower as compared to their original rate. India has negotiated the free trade agreements with many nations, including Sri Lanka and many trading blocs, etc., such as ASEAN. Then we have the preferential trade agreement. It is one step lower than the free trade agreement, in which the countries agree to give preferential right of entry to certain products only and not a lot. This is done by reducing the duties on certain products and not many of them. India has signed a preferential trade agreement with Afghanistan. Then we also have something called the Bilateral Investment Treaty, BIT. This was especially in the news when the Vodafone issue was in the news, when the government had imposed a lot of tax penalty on Vodafone. It is a bilateral agreement in which the two countries decide on conditions for private investments. For example, if someone from UK invests their money in India, what will be the rules governing that? If someone from India invests their money in UAE, how will that investment be perceived? That is a BIT. India has signed multiple BITs with over 80 nations right now, including most of our trading partners such as US, Singapore, UK, etc. The next article that we have here talks about the situation of the environment in India right now, and that India's plans of achieving net zero by 2070 might not be enough, and that if we have to ensure that the environment is preserved for the future generations, our action should be much quicker than that. The article here says that the Prime Minister Modi recently said that it is not the environment that is fragile. Rather, it is the people's commitment to not cause any harm to the climate that is fragile. And if we actually have to safeguard our earth, there has to be a change in how we consume things, in how we make energy, in how we live our entire life. The author here says that rather than blaming the industrial revolution and the machines for all the environmental problems that we are facing, it is time to face the reality. As per the article, our practices of agriculture, dominance of wheat and rice as our food crops, which require a lot of water and which require a lot of pesticides and fertilizers to be used, these need to be blamed for long-term climate change. Our activities that result in clearing of the forest were the ones that have introduced large-scale changes to global climate. And just putting all the blame on industries and industrial age would be unfair on the developed nations. The one thing that has remained common throughout the world, irrespective of whichever nation that you talk about, is that it is the poor people that have suffered the most because of climate change. In India also, despite the fact that geology of Himalayas is extremely fragile and the region is not suited for building big roads and dams, etc., The governments over the years have been taking up several mega engineering projects, which has led to frequent floods and landslides and earthquakes in the state of Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. Whenever we have a global climate change summit, India's position remains that we are not responsible for historical climate change, and thus our use of coal and fossil fuels should not be limited because we are still increasing our use of fossil fuels in order to take our development at par with the developed world. The author here says, but India cannot rely on that aspect. If we want to pollute the environment as much as the developed nations did in the past, we would not be left with any environment to protect 100 years down the line. The fact remains that India will continue to use coal plants, raise our forests for industry, build roads even in the areas which are pretty fragile, by arguing that it is the developed nations that did it 100 years back or 80 years back. But the problem is the entire environment is one, and we would have a price to pay in the near future. The article concludes by saying that India's commitment to reach net zero by 2070 right now seems very far away, but steps in that direction need to be taken right now. Now, it is also important to put light into what steps are we trying to take in that direction. India has been making a lot of progress in the field of renewable energy. In fact, the target that we had set ourselves of achieving 40% of the installed energy capacity from non-fossil fuel by 2030, we achieved that target in November 2021 itself. And that is why we increased our target in the recently held Glasgow summit. Right now, our installed renewable energy capacity is about 150 gigawatts. And our target is that we want to increase that capacity to 500 gigawatts by the end of the year 2030. Out of the 150 gigawatts energy, we get about 48 gigawatts from solar, about 40 from wind, 4.8 from small hydropower, and biopower makes up about 10 gigawatts of energy. Although we talk a lot about nuclear energy, but the fact remains that the contribution of nuclear in India's renewable energy scenario still remains meager at just 6.78 gigawatts. India has been doing particularly well in harnessing the wind energy, and right now we are the fourth largest producer of wind energy throughout the world. The target of 500 gigawatts seems like far-fetched because of a lot of problems that we are facing. First, it requires a lot of finances. Putting up solar power plants or putting up wind power plants requires a lot of initial investment, which is something that can be a stumbling block for the government. It also requires huge land to be acquired by the government, especially that is in the private hands, which can delay the entire process. It will also require for the government to create an entire ecosystem. For instance, there need to be proper manufacturing done of solar panels. There need to be people who are skilled in that technology. We need to have enough experts to take care of maintenance and other parts whenever we set up this particular kind of infrastructure. All of these are still in the nascent stage in India, and that is why there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. The government has taken multiple initiatives in the past few years to give a push to renewable energy. These are some of the examples. This includes a PM Kusum scheme for installation of solar pumps in rural areas. We also have the solar park scheme to make large-scale grid-connected solar power projects. We also have the hydrogen mission, through which the government is trying to make India a global hub of green hydrogen production, etc. They are also a part of international alliances such as the International Solar Alliance and One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative that was recently released at the Climate Change Summit at Glasgow. The next news is from Canada, the country where the Canadian Prime Minister has recently invoked national emergency using the Emergencies Act for the first time since the act was passed in 1980s. If you have been following the news, you would know that a few months back, a lot of truckers in Canada came out on the roads, started protesting against a vaccine mandate. So the law in Canada is that if truckers go to the US, once they come back from the US, they will only be allowed if they are fully vaccinated. If you are going to US and you are coming back, you need to show your vaccination certificate. That is the main demand of the truckers, that this vaccination mandate should go away. Now, although the demand started with this, over the past few days, a lot of other demands have been attached to the initial demands of the truckers. For example, now the truckers also want that the other restrictions that have been imposed by the government due to the pandemic should be taken back. In fact, some of the protesters are even saying that the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau should resign. All of this has created a lot of pressure on the Prime Minister, and thus the government has decided to finally invoke national emergency in a country that is usually considered as extremely peaceful without a lot of protest. Now, these truckers are calling themselves the Freedom Convoy, and as I said, the demonstration started mainly because of the vaccine mandate. The center of all those protests is the capital of Ottawa and the nearby areas. In the past couple of weeks, these truckers have begun harassing other people also. Anyone who is not supporting them is being harassed by the truckers. They are blocking a lot of important national highways in the country, and they're not allowing products to be transported from one place to the other, thus forcing the government to take this strict action. The Prime Minister, as I said, invoked the Emergencies Act, which gives a lot of power to the central government, including imposing prohibitions on the protest, allowing the law enforcement authorities to remove the trucks by using force, even authorizing financial institutions to freeze the accounts of those who are funding the protest, including the personal bank account of those truckers or the truck drivers, as you would call them. Although this act allows the Canadian government to take action anywhere in the country, the Prime Minister has assured that action will only be taken in those cities where public order is in danger and where the truckers have most of the presence. The interesting part here is, in a lot of surveys that have been conducted throughout Canada, most of the Canadian people are against this idea of truckers holding the entire country on hostage. 70% people in a survey said that they supported the vaccine mandate. 62% people disagreed with the message that the truckers convoy are now propagating, and more than 80% people have been against the truckers for blocking the roads and national highways. However, these demonstrations have now gone outside Canada also. Similar demonstrations were seen in US and France and in some other parts of the European nations. After the Emergencies Act was proclaimed, strict police action has started on some of the protesters, and the police hopes to arrest many more in the coming days. There is also a misconception that a lot of Indian origin people might be involved in this protest in Canada, which is actually not the case. Canada has a big population of South Asian people, including Indians. However, most of Indians and South Asians are not participating in this protest. In fact, as per the truckers who are from the Indian community, the Freedom Convoy is actually not representing their views and is distracting the situation from the other important problems. According to them, the government should rather have focused on the real issues like the low wages that they have to survive on, like the shortage of manpower, like the fact that their trucks, etc., are not in the best of conditions. But this convoy, which is being said to be funded by those people who are against the Canadian government, is getting a lot of money and power from illegal methods and is not really representative of the real issue that the truckers are facing in Canada. Now, just to give you a small idea about the Emergencies Act, the headline might be that it is for the first time that this act has been used, but it is not, because Canada has never faced emergency. So the fact is that this particular law was only passed in 1988. Before this, there was some other law that allowed the government to impose emergency, which was used 3 times. But it is since 1988 that for the first time this law is used. This law first gives power to the government for only 30 days to control the situation. And after that, it can be extended even further. The law, however, requires very strict conditions to be imposed. For example, there must be a serious damage to the life, health, and safety of the Canadians. As per the law, there can be 4 types of emergencies in Canada: public welfare, public order, international emergency, or war emergency. And it is expected that this one would come under the public order emergency criteria. It even allows the government to bar people from traveling to certain specific areas which are important to the government. As you know, when the protest first started, the Prime Minister and his entire family was actually taken to a secret location so that they could not be attacked by the outside people. Now, under this act, people would not be allowed to travel to those areas which are important hubs of the Government of Canada. As I said earlier, the Emergencies Act of 1988 has never been applied before this. The next article here comes from the world of science and gives a great news for researchers who are working in the field of HIV. There was a news that came out recently that only the third person in the history of the world has recently been cured from the HIV. That is the human immunodeficiency virus, which leads to the disease of AIDS. The reason why this news has been celebrated throughout the world, especially in the medical world, is that the technology used for curing this third person is different from the earlier two. Because the first two people who were actually cured of HIV did not survive long because they were caught with other diseases such as cancer, because their body had become so weak after the procedure that it could not sustain any other reactions. But this recent patient seems to be in a much better state, and thus there is hope that it would lead to new discoveries in the field of treating HIV. The woman that we are talking about is a 60-year-old African American woman who was diagnosed with HIV in 2013. And thus, she started with the standard HIV treatment called the antiretroviral treatment. This treatment usually has three drugs, that is, tenofovir, emtricitabine, and reltegravir. In 2017, she was later diagnosed with cancer, that is leukemia. Now, for anyone who is infected with HIV, it is very common for them to catch another very major disease. That is because the HIV virus works in such a way that once it enters your body, it lowers the immunity of your body to such a large extent that even if you don't die of HIV, you would catch a major disease very soon because your body would not be able to sustain any other reaction. That is the amount of harm that the HIV virus can do to your body. Now, the turning point in the journey of this lady was that in 2017, she received cord blood or the embryonic stem cells. Now, cord blood simply means that when a child is born, the umbilical cord that connects the child to the mother, in that cord, there are certain stem cells. If they are preserved at the time of the birth of the baby, they can be used later on if the baby has any harmful disease, and those stem cells can actually be extremely helpful for curing that baby in the future. There are many stem cells banks also which are now available in major cities where you can store the stem cells of your baby at the time of the birth. Now, stem cells of another person who had a rare mutation which naturally blocks HIV virus in his or her body, those stem cells were given to this lady. So, for example, we have a person A who has a rare condition under which this person's body has a very rare mutation. This rare mutation does not allow HIV to enter his body. This A person who is very lucky, his stem cells that were preserved at the time of the birth were actually donated to this 60-year-old lady that we are talking about. The doctors hope that while we are donating the stem cells, they will bring into the lady the same quality that this person has. That is, this person's body does not allow the HIV to grow. So maybe the same will happen to this 60-year-old. That was the hope. This A was a relative of this 60-year-old. This was an experiment and it worked successfully. That is, these stem cells boosted the patient's immunity to such a large extent that now lady's immune system kicked out the HIV virus. The doctors now say that as per the recent reports, there are no signs of HIV in her blood and the body does not even have any antibodies to the virus. Means it is those stem cells only that have worked the magic. As I said in the beginning, before this lady, only two people have been cured of HIV so far. Both of them relied on the bone marrow transplantation from the donors that have a similar kind of a mutation that does not allow the HIV virus to grow in their body. So the difference is, in this third patient, we took the stem cells of those donors who have this special mutation. In the earlier two cases, rather than having the stem cells, we took their bone marrow transplantation. Now, while those two patients were also cleared, but they did not live a lot longer, they died of cancer just a few years later. But the doctors are much more hopeful and optimistic about the future of this third patient now. This woman, in fact, has been discharged from the hospital after 17 days of the transplant, and there is no disease that is found in her body. But she is still in the early stages of the treatment, so it remains to be seen whether there is a long-term implication of this treatment or not. Since we don't have any vaccine for HIV right now, this is the one technique that can give hope to lakhs and lakhs of people who are facing the problem of HIV around the world. In India also in 2019, there were 23.48 lakh people who had HIV. The maximum number of those people were in Maharashtra, followed by Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. Thus, if this technique actually turns out to be effective, it can be a boon for these people in India as well. Now, a lot of people have some confusion between HIV and AIDS and how exactly are they different. So, in simple terms, HIV is a virus when it enters your body, it attacks CD4. Now, CD4 is a type of a white blood cell. White blood cell is an important part of your body's immune system. Now, once the T cells get infected because of this virus, they move around your body and they start damaging other cells of your body as well. Thus, the problem with HIV is that it destroys a lot of CD4 cells, which form an integral part of your immune system. Also, once this virus enters your body, there is no way to remove this virus. The CD4 count, because of the infection, starts to reduce in the body, and this is when your body becomes extremely weak. In a healthy body, CD4 cells should be somewhere around 500 to 1600. But in a person who is infected with HIV, this number can go as low as 200. AIDS now is actually the last stage of the HIV infection, when the body of the person is badly impacted and they are not able to fight against any infection. Now, if a person is detected with HIV, it is possible that he or she might not reach the stage of AIDS. For example, in the US, when people detect HIV early, they don't develop AIDS. Why? Because they start taking the HIV medicine and the disease does not go ahead. A person with HIV is only considered to have reached the stage of AIDS when the number of CD4 cells fall below the 200 mark. That is 200 cells per cubic millimeter of the blood. India right now is home to the world's third largest population of HIV, and we aim to end the problem of HIV by 2030. As we discussed earlier, just because someone has caught HIV doesn't mean the person would have to die, because if the person starts medicine, it would not convert into AIDS and the immune system will be able to sustain for a long life. India is already a signatory to the UN AIDS program of the 90-90-90 strategy. Now, this 90-90-90 strategy is very simple. That means out of all the people who have HIV, at least 90% should know that they have HIV, because no detection is also a major problem. Out of those, 90% should start their treatment at least, and then out of those, at least 90% should go towards a speedy recovery. In 2017, 79% of people in India having HIV were aware of their status, so we have a long way to catch up the 90-90-90 goal. These were the articles important from the Hindu newspaper today. Just a couple of practice questions. Number 1. Discuss the potential of India-UAE bilateral relations beyond the trade in oil. Second, loss of lives by road accidents in India is one of the highest in the world. What are the causes behind it? Also suggest ways to ensure better road safety in the country. Both these questions have to be answered in 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.